I'm Ben Kelley, and I'm with a group called the Institute for Injury Reduction. And our work is directed just at what our name implies, and that is trying to reduce injuries. Not all kinds of injuries, but the biggest component of injuries, which are those caused by unsafe products. I'm going to talk to you this morning, or today, at whatever time it is you're looking at this tape, about some unsafe products that you are very commonly associated with, and all of us in society are, but we may not be aware of. But first, let me give you a little bit of the cultural and the historical background to how we think about injuries in our society and why it has really taken us so very long to get a good handle on ways to reduce injuries. If you look back into Deuteronomy, the Old Testament laws, you'll find one law that says, very interestingly, that when you build your house, and keep in mind that this was directed at folks living in the Mediterranean in Old Testament times where everybody slept on the roof at night in order to keep cool. So the law was that when you build your house, you are to build around the roof a parapet, so that when your sleeping guest rolls around in his or her sleep, the guests do not fall off the roof and be hurt or killed and bring the blood and the guilt of their injury onto your head. In other words, to put it in modern terms, when you make something that may hurt somebody, do your best in the design of that product to prevent that injury from occurring. But that, as it turns out, is a very, very new concept in our society. Historically and theologically, blame has been placed on victims for their illness and for their injury. And I think you can probably think of many examples of bad people being the alleged explanation for illness and disease and for injury. Lepers were traditionally thought to be victims of God's ill will because they had done something wrong. Sick people through the ages have been treated with a mixture of good science and bad folklore and bad theology. The judgments about the victims of injury and their responsibility for their own acts began to abate in the 18th and 19th centuries, and now basically we have a modern approach to illness and to injury that says we're not interested in finding out whether it was bad acts that caused human impairment. We're interested in stopping that impairment. But we still do have touches of that in our society, and I'll come back to the main theme in a moment. But one of those is, and we see it every day, in society's initial reaction to AIDS, which has been a reaction of blaming people for supposedly bad behavior that got them in contact with the microorganism that causes the disease, rather than going about the much more important job of finding ways to eradicate the microorganism or protect the human body when it comes in contact so that it doesn't get that particular very deadly virus. These same concepts apply to injury, and these same failings have applied to injury, and probably can be summed up by such expressions as, well, those stupid teenagers, look how they drove. You know, well, those drunken kids, they got in that car, and what can you expect? Or, well, that guy was driving too fast, and that's why he hit the rear end of that other car, and that's what caused the fire. The fact of the matter is that the causes of the events that can produce injury and the causes of the injury are very, very different. And let's go back to the automobile, which is where I wanted to start, and what I want to talk with you about a little bit about the systems that are designed to protect us and sometimes that unfortunately hurt us in the modern automobile that we come into contact with every time we get into a car and take for granted and really don't think about too much. One of those systems is the seatbelt system. Now, 20 years ago, seatbelts were an oddity in the United States. They were just coming into popular use in Europe and Australia, and there was great resistance on the part both of users and of manufacturers to providing and making use of seatbelts. Today, we take it for granted that most folks put their seatbelts on because they're required to by law, and that it is correct, as the little placard often says on the side of the car, that if you buckle up, you'll be safe. Seatbelts give us a very good and sometimes frightening lesson of just how injury reduction can work or not work. And let me give you some examples in the seatbelt systems that we all come in contact with today. When you get into your car, you are getting into a product that inherently has a tremendous amount of energy built into it. and which at any time, although we don't think of this as we're driving happily or grumpily along the roads, at any time can turn on you in a crash situation, very often one over which the driver has no control, and become a discharger of highly lethal energy. And this happens in a matter of literally thousandths of a second. In those thousandths of a second, there is virtually nothing that the occupant or the driver can do to control the injury. The decisions as to whether those injuries will happen or not happen have already been made in advance by the manufacturer of the product. And those decisions will determine what kind of a safety belt is in the car or what kind of a restraint system. Modern cars are equipped with airbags, and I'll talk about those a little bit in a moment, and how well that car will manage the forces of the crash so that those forces are attenuated and kept away from the occupant as effectively as possible. Let's go into our heads and go off and be driving down the road for a moment in some different kinds of cars, and I'll play the game of switching seatbelt systems around, and you can kind of follow along and imagine that with me. Let's say we're in the standard American car made between, say, 1975 and 1990, and we're in the front seat, and I'm the driver and you're the passenger. We are wearing what is called a 3-point manual lap shoulder belt. Basically a very good system. It is a single belt or a lap and shoulder belt connected together that comes across the body and buckles over here on this side and is fastened to the car, so that when there is a crash, the retractor of this belt, the spool that keeps it snug against us, locks up. The belt restrains our bodies from moving forward or being thrown out of the car, and does a good job of restraining us. That's a good system, but it can be eroded and has been eroded in many cars of American manufacture. If now we're in a car made, say, by General Motors, during much of that same period, unfortunately, the shoulder portion of the belt, in which we're now using, may be loose, and it may be loose because the manufacturer has put a device in the belt to make it loose, so that we'll be more comfortable. We haven't been told, unfortunately, that that looseness, once a crash occurs, can turn against us and defeat the very purpose of the belt, which is to hold us tightly in place. So we want to determine that the belt that we're using doesn't have looseness in it and hasn't been designed so that it will defeat that purpose. Now, why in the world would a manufacturer put a device in a belt to make it loose when tightness is what we need? The answer is that many manufacturers, due to their lack of concern with safety, have placed the anchorage points of their shoulder belts so that for many, many people of other than average size, the belt fits uncomfortably. It comes across the neck if you're short. It may come across the face of a child. Their choice has been to either do a better job in designing that belt so that it will fit you better and be placed better. One way of doing that, by the way, is an adjustable anchorage point, a point that actually allows you to move the shoulder belt up and down. But the cheap, quick, dirty, and dangerous way is to simply say to you, you can put some slack into this belt, then it will fit you, then it won't come across your neck uncomfortably, but in a crash, its performance will be seriously degraded. So that's one example of a good safety objective, the good old standard 3-point lap shoulder belt that has been eroded by manufacturer indifference. Another belt that we strongly recommend people watch out for and avoid if at all possible, and particularly for children, is the lap-only belt in the rear seats of most cars. Imagine now that we're sitting in the back seat of a car and we're wearing a lap belt. That is a belt that only goes around the waist, and a frontal crash has occurred. Our bodies now are being flung forward against this belt. All of the force of the crash is being localized and concentrated at this very vulnerable spot on the body, which is the midriff. And a number of terrible things can happen as a result of our not having a shoulder belt to restrain the upper torso. One is that heads will fling forward, and heads can impact the floor, the knees, or the interior of the car, with serious brain damage, and this is a common cause of brain damage. Another is that the abdominal organs can be traumatized, and there can be death from internal bleeding or very serious permanent injury such as permanent colostomies. A final and very common and tragic outcome is that the spinal cord can be damaged with resulting paraplegia or lower level quadriplegia, depending on where the belt is placed. Very, very belatedly, the manufacturers have begun to equip their new cars with rear seat lap shoulder belts so as to avoid these injuries. And this is particularly imperative, as I've said, for families with children, because children are commonly the folks that we put in the back seat. So they are commonly the people who are most exposed to these kinds of injuries. Still, there are 140 million cars on the roads today that do not have shoulder belts in the rear seats, and those cars present highly lethal restraint systems for their occupants. Coming up to today, and the most modern of cars, we find the fleet of cars made since the late 1980s, and particularly since 1990, are equipped in their front seats with so-called automatic restraints. Now, all automatic restraints are not the same, and in fact they range from terribly inadequate and sometimes hazardous systems to very, very effective systems. I will give you the bad news and then end with the good news. The bad news is that these so-called automatic belts, these are belts that supposedly put themselves on you so that you do not have to do the job of buckling up, are in the vast majority of cases designed so that they have very serious safety defects. I will point out two of those to you. One is the design which we are seeing more and more commonly in new cars, in which the shoulder belt is attached to the door. It may be attached to the door through a motor, it may be attached to the door at a fixed point. But the central problem is that because it is attached to the door and not to the car, when the door opens in the crash, and doors open in crashes some 12 to 15% of the time, suddenly the belt has been removed from the occupant at the very moment when the belt is most needed, and nothing is restraining the user and keeping the user inside of the car. So we have this tragic anomaly of goodwill, people of goodwill, safety-conscious people, choosing an automatic belt because they think it's better and finding that at the moment that it is most needed, it lets you down. And this is resulting in well-documented deaths and injuries. And our prediction is that manufacturers eventually, because of litigation and bad publicity, are going to be forced to stop making these systems. Nonetheless, there are tens of millions of cars out there with these systems today. The other drawback to automatic belt designs is that many of them have a separate lap belt. And users will get into the car, have the automatic shoulder belt come across the body, and completely forget that they must still do this. That is, they must make the motion of buckling up that they've always had to make, and if they did not, they would be at risk. A shoulder belt alone, and if you have this kind of car, I urge you to use the lap belt each time you get in. A shoulder belt alone is one of the most hazardous belt systems imaginable. It has been outlawed in Europe for 2 decades because of the kinds of injuries that it can do, hanging injuries and upper torso injuries as well as ejections, and it should not be permitted in American cars today. It is a sad commentary on the backward state of safety regulation that these systems are even allowed. Those are the bad news sides of the ledger, but let's look at the good news. The good news is that more and more cars are being equipped with airbags. Airbags are inflatable cushions that emerge from the steering wheel or the dashboard or wherever they have been placed by the manufacturer and the designer of the car just at the moment of the crash and catch the body, distributing the force of the crash across the entire body and cushioning it just like a big pillow. It's encouraging that at long last we are getting airbags in new cars. It is discouraging that it has taken since 1971, when airbag technology was perfected and ready to be installed in new cars, to achieve this accomplishment. And we in the injury control field estimate that probably more than 100,000 people have died and more than 500,000 have been very, very seriously injured because they did not have airbags during this period when they could have been available. In sum, I think the lesson and the moral of all this is that we are still living, if you would, just at the end of the dark ages of injury reduction and injury control in our society. Technologies exist and concepts exist which could do a great deal to save lives and reduce injuries, whether in motor vehicle crashes, in the use of deadly all-terrain vehicles, in injuries from motorboat propeller blades, in rollovers of utility vehicles, and the list goes on and on and on. When the day comes that manufacturers are made responsible for making their products safe, and we stop blaming the user each time something goes wrong, we will begin to make all the necessary progress to remove injury from its very dubious place as the #1 killer of Americans age birth to 50, a place it has occupied for all too long, as the most expensive health problem in the nation, costing us well over $50 billion a year. And we will bring this problem under control. Thank you.